For 18 years, Barron Trump remained a mystery. He was a name everyone knew but a voice no one had ever truly heard. While his father dominated headlines with fiery speeches and controversial statements, and his mother captivated the public with grace and quiet resilience, Barron existed in the shadows. The youngest son of one of the most powerful families in America, he grew up under constant media scrutiny, every move dissected, every expression analyzed. Yet, through it all, he chose silence. It wasn't that he had nothing to say. In fact, he had plenty of thoughts about the world changing around him, about the struggles of his generation, about the mounting pressures facing young Americans. But from an early age, he learned a harsh truth: in his world, words were weapons. Anything he said could be twisted, misinterpreted, or used against him. He had seen it happen to his parents, watched as headlines spun narratives that often bore little resemblance to reality. So he made a decision: silence was safer. But silence, he would later realize, was also a prison. For years, he stood on the sidelines, watching America evolve, witnessing the rise of social movements, economic struggles, and political turmoil. He scrolled through social media, seeing the frustration of young people drowning in student debt, struggling to afford housing, and questioning if the American dream was still within reach. He saw protests erupting across the country, voices crying out for fairness and justice. And yet, through it all, he remained quiet, a spectator in a world that seemed to be falling apart. Until one day, something changed. Something so powerful, so undeniable, that even Barron Trump, the boy who had spent 18 years in silence, could no longer stay quiet. Barron Trump had spent most of his life watching the world from a distance. He had grown up in penthouses, private estates, and secured political spaces, shielded from the everyday struggles of most Americans. Yet, even from his place of privilege, he could see that something was deeply wrong. The America he had always known, the land of opportunity, the land where hard work was supposed to pay off, was slipping away. And for young people like him, the future felt increasingly uncertain. At first, these realizations came in glimpses: headlines about rising student loan debt, stories of college graduates saddled with six-figure tuition burdens, unable to afford even a small apartment. He read about families struggling with rent as housing prices skyrocketed, about middle-class workers being replaced by machines, about towns where once thriving industries had vanished, leaving behind nothing but abandoned factories and shattered dreams. He saw people his age, bright and ambitious, working multiple minimum-wage jobs just to survive, their dreams of stability slipping further away with each passing year. But it wasn't until one night, alone in his room, scrolling through social media, that the full weight of this reality hit him. A comment, buried among thousands of others, made him pause. "We don't have a voice. They don't care what we think. Maybe it's best to stay silent and accept our fate." Barron felt something tighten in his chest. For the first time, he saw himself in those words. He, too, had chosen silence, believing that his voice wouldn't change anything. That no one would listen. That speaking up would only bring trouble. But then another thought surfaced, one he couldn't shake: if we all stay silent, who will change this? That question haunted him. Over the next few days, he couldn't stop thinking about it. He turned on the news and saw protests erupting across America, streets filled with young people holding signs, demanding action. They weren't asking for handouts. They weren't demanding the impossible. They simply wanted fairness, fairness in education, fairness in employment, fairness in the way their country was run. But no one was listening. Politicians on television argued back and forth, pointing fingers instead of offering real solutions. The rich got richer, while those struggling were told to just work harder. Then, a video caught his attention. A young woman, no older than him, stood outside a government building, holding a sign that read, "We don't want a future drowned in debt. We need real jobs, not empty promises. Listen to us." Her voice rang out in the heavy silence. "We are not lazy. We are not asking for what we don't deserve. We just want a fair chance, an education that won't bury us in debt for life, a job that allows us to live, not just survive. Is that really too much to ask? Barron watched as she looked up at the towering government building in front of her. But the doors remained shut. The curtains behind the windows stayed closed. No one responded. Then, everything changed. A group of officers approached, ordering the crowd to disperse. No one resisted, but somehow, the tension escalated. Someone was pushed. Someone stumbled. A scream rang out. The young woman was shoved backward. It wasn't an act of violence, but the way she fell, the way her trembling hands clutched onto her sign as if it were the only thing keeping her standing, made something inside Barron shatter. For the first time in his life, he felt rage. Not the kind that explodes in reckless fury, but the kind that burns slow, deep, and unforgiving. A realization crashed over him like a tidal wave: silence was no longer an option. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat in front of his laptop, staring at a blank screen, his mind racing. Memories of every injustice he had witnessed flooded back, every face filled with frustration, every voice that had gone unheard. And then, a single thought remained, louder than all the rest. If I don't speak up now, then when? His hands trembled as he placed them on the keyboard. But he didn't hesitate. He started to type. The first words of a speech that would change his life forever. For most of his life, Barron Trump had lived behind high walls, both literal and figurative. The world he knew was one of polished floors, gated mansions, and black SUVs with tinted windows. He had never worried about rent, about where his next meal would come from, or whether he could afford a doctor's visit. But now, for the first time, he felt the weight of those who did. He knew that reading about struggle and actually seeing it were two different things. So, he made a decision: he needed to step outside of his world, to listen, to learn, to understand. One evening, wearing a plain hoodie and jeans, Barron left the familiar comforts of his home and walked into a world that had always been just outside his doorstep but had felt a million miles away. No bodyguards. No cameras. Just him, blending into the streets of New York City, looking for the stories behind the statistics. The first person he met was Marcus, a college senior drowning in student debt. They sat on a worn-out bench near campus as Marcus recounted his struggles. I did everything they told me to, Marcus said, staring at the ground. Studied hard, got into a good school, took out loans because I thought it would be worth it. Now I'm $120,000 in debt, and I can't even find a job that pays enough to cover the interest. There was exhaustion in his voice, exhaustion Barron had never felt before. Later that night, Barron walked through a quieter part of the city and met Linda, a single mother working 2 minimum-wage jobs just to keep her family afloat. She wiped her hands on her apron, the lines on her face deep with fatigue. I used to have a decent job, she told him. Worked in manufacturing for 10 years. Then one day, they told me a machine could do it faster. Just like that, I was out. Now I work night shifts at a diner and clean offices during the day. I barely see my kids. She forced a small smile, but her hands trembled. I don't want anyone's pity, she added. I just want a fair shot at providing for my family. Barron listened. Not just with his ears, but with his heart. He had seen people talk about these struggles on the news, but this was different. This was real. This was a mother, a father, a student, a worker, people trying, people fighting, people exhausted from a system that seemed designed to hold them back. Every story he heard added another weight to his shoulders. The American dream, he realized, was no longer something that everyone had a fair chance at. It was slipping away for too many. When he returned home that night, his mind was heavy with everything he had seen. He sat across from his mother at the kitchen table, his voice quiet but firm. I want to help them, he said. But I don't know where to start. She studied him for a long moment, then spoke words that would stay with him forever. If you want to help them, the first thing you have to do is let them know you're listening. And for the first time in his life, Barron Trump understood that change didn't start with speeches or policies. It started with listening. Barron Trump had spent weeks absorbing stories of hardship, listening to the struggles of students, single parents, and workers fighting to survive in an economy that seemed to be leaving them behind. He had walked through neighborhoods where hope felt like a luxury, where dreams were measured not in ambition, but in whether people could afford rent that month. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just hearing about America's problems, he was seeing them firsthand. But what could he do? He wasn't a politician. He wasn't an activist. He had never stood on a stage, never faced a crowd, never spoken a word that truly mattered to anyone beyond his family. Then came the email. A student organization had found his anonymous writings online, his essays about the people he had met, the stories he had gathered, the injustices he had witnessed. They had been moved by his words. Inspired. And now, they wanted him to speak at a youth forum on the future of his generation. At first, he froze. The idea of standing in front of a packed auditorium, with cameras rolling and skeptical eyes watching, made his stomach tighten. His entire life, he had avoided the spotlight. His silence had been his shield. Now, he was being asked to tear it down. That night, he paced his room, staring at his laptop, rereading the invitation over and over. Every fear, every doubt came rushing in. Who am I to do this? What if I fail? What if they laugh at me? What if my words don't matter? He considered ignoring the email, pretending he had never seen it. It would be easier that way. Safe. But then, an image flashed through his mind, Marcus, sitting on that bench, his shoulders heavy with debt. Linda, wiping her tired hands on her apron, working 2 shifts just to keep food on the table. The young woman in the protest, clutching her sign as if it were the only thing keeping her from falling apart. They didn't have the luxury of staying silent. Neither did he. Taking a deep breath, Barron sat down, placed his hands on the keyboard, and typed 2 simple words. I accept. The moment he pressed send, a new kind of fear settled in, not the fear of speaking, but the fear of failing those who needed someone to finally say what they had been screaming into the void for years. The following days were restless. He buried himself in preparation, watching speeches from great leaders, studying the art of public speaking. He wrote and rewrote his speech, each word weighed with the responsibility of representing those who had never been given a microphone. One evening, his mother found him sitting on the balcony, staring out at the city lights. She didn't need to ask what was on his mind. Instead, she sat beside him and spoke softly. Do you remember when you were little? Every time you had to stand in front of a crowd, you'd reach for my hand. Barron smiled faintly. He did remember. Those moments, when fear threatened to consume him, his mother's hand had always been his anchor. But this time, he whispered, I have to stand alone. She looked at him, her eyes filled with quiet strength. No, Barron. You're not alone. The people you've met, the ones you've listened to, they'll be standing with you. Your voice isn't just yours anymore. It's theirs. And for the first time, he believed it. The night before the speech, Barron Trump couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. In less than 24 hours, he would stand on a stage, face a crowd of students, activists, and reporters, and speak words that could either ignite change or fall flat. His stomach churned with doubt. For 18 years, he had been silent. Now, he was about to break that silence in front of the entire nation. The morning of the event, as he stepped into the car, the city outside seemed different, louder, faster, heavier. He barely heard the chatter of his team as they reviewed logistics. His thoughts drowned out everything. What if he forgot his words? What if no one listened? What if this was a mistake? At the event hall, the energy was electric. Hundreds of students packed the auditorium, their conversations buzzing with anticipation. Some were there because they believed in him. Others came out of curiosity, skeptical that the son of a billionaire could possibly understand their struggles. Behind the stage, Barron stood alone, gripping his notes so tightly his knuckles turned white. His phone vibrated, messages from friends, family, even strangers. Some were encouraging, "This is your moment. Make them listen." Others were brutal, "You're just a rich kid playing activist." A deep breath. A final glance at his speech. Then, a voice from the doorway, "Barron, you're on in 5. He exhaled, clenched his fists, just like he had as a child before stepping onto a stage for a school recital. Except this was different. This wasn't just about him. As he walked toward the blinding stage lights, he caught a glimpse of his mother in the front row. She gave him a small nod, her eyes steady. He didn't need to ask. He knew, she believed in him. Then, he stepped forward. The audience fell into a hush as he approached the microphone. Cameras clicked. Reporters scribbled notes. The weight of a nation's expectation pressed down on him. For a moment, silence stretched between him and the crowd. Then, he spoke. "I have been silent for 18 years. A murmur rippled through the audience. Some leaned forward, intrigued. Others crossed their arms, waiting to see if he had anything worth saying. People always ask me why. Why haven't I spoken? Why haven't I shared my thoughts? Is it because I don't care? Is it because I have nothing to say?" But that's not the truth. His gaze swept the room, landing on the students in the back, the ones who looked like Marcus, like Linda, like the young woman from the protest. "I stayed silent because I thought my voice didn't matter. And I know I'm not the only one who has ever felt that way." The room stilled. But then I realized, that very thought is what holds us back. He paused, letting the words sink in. "I have met students drowning in debt, working themselves to exhaustion just to survive. I have met workers replaced by machines, left behind with no safety net. I have met people who feel like their voices don't count, like no one is listening. And the scariest thing isn't that these problems exist. The scariest thing is that so many believe they will never change." Somewhere in the back, someone started clapping. Then another. But that is a lie. The applause grew louder, swelling through the auditorium. If we keep waiting for someone else to fix things, how long will we have to wait? If we don't stand up, if we don't speak out, who will? And then, the moment that no one expected, hundreds of students, some who had walked in skeptical, rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, chanting. It wasn't just applause. It was something bigger. A movement had begun. And Barron Trump had just set it in motion. The morning after his speech, Barron Trump woke up to a world that had changed overnight. His phone was flooded with messages. Some were from strangers, students, workers, single parents, people who had seen his speech and felt, for the first time, that someone was speaking for them. "You said exactly what I've been thinking my whole life." Finally, someone with a platform who actually listens. Others were from critics, some brutal, some dismissive. Just another rich kid pretending to care. Easy to talk about struggle when you've never had to worry about paying rent. News outlets dissected his every word. Social media exploded. His speech was being shared millions of times, debated, analyzed, picked apart by pundits on television. Some praised him as a rare voice of truth, a young person who wasn't afraid to call out the system. Others dismissed him as privileged, naive, and out of touch. And then, the phone call came. His father. The voice on the other end was calm but firm. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Barron remained silent. "You just put yourself at the center of a battle you're not prepared to fight." He gripped the phone tighter. He had expected this. This is something I need to do. A long pause. Then his father exhaled. You think one speech changes the world? The world doesn't work like that. Politics doesn't work like that. Barron knew the truth in those words. Change wouldn't come from one speech. But he also knew something else: if no one spoke up, nothing would ever change. So what do you expect me to do? Stay silent? His father's response was quiet but heavy. Sometimes, silence is the only way to protect yourself. That sentence lingered in Barron's mind long after the call ended. He had spent years believing that. That silence was safety. That keeping quiet meant avoiding the chaos, the criticism, the attacks. But now, he realized something else. Silence was also surrender. The backlash escalated. A veteran politician appeared on a morning news show, shaking his head at the camera. This kid doesn't understand real struggle. He's never had to work 3 jobs just to afford tuition. He's never worried about putting food on the table. What does he actually know about the real America? The clip went viral. Some agreed. Others fought back. Finally, someone from his world is calling out the truth. Easy for him to say. Has he ever actually struggled? At least he's using his privilege to give others a voice. What are you doing? The debate spread like wildfire. And in the middle of it all, Barron had to make a choice. Did he retreat? Let things die down? Return to his life of quiet anonymity? Or did he stand his ground, no matter the cost? That night, he sat by his window, staring at the city skyline. He thought of Marcus. He thought of Linda. He thought of the girl at the protest. And then, he knew. There was only one option. He stood up, grabbed his phone, and opened his laptop. This time, he wasn't just writing another post. This time, he was preparing for something much bigger. The backlash didn't stop. If anything, it grew louder. Every news outlet had an opinion. Some praised Barron Trump as a rare voice of truth in a political landscape that had long ignored young people. Others attacked him relentlessly, calling him naive, privileged, or worse, a pawn in a political game he didn't even understand. Yet, despite the noise, something else was happening. Something bigger. Messages flooded in, not just from supporters, but from people ready to act. Students. Workers. Teachers. Even young politicians. They weren't just applauding his words, they were asking, what's next? How do we make real change? And that's when Barron realized, this was no longer about him. A speech wasn't enough. Words alone couldn't fix a broken system. If he was serious about change, he had to do more than speak. He had to create something tangible. He started small. He launched online discussions, live forums where young people could share their experiences, voice their frustrations, and, most importantly, be heard. His first live stream drew thousands. Then tens of thousands. People weren't just watching, they were participating. A college student from California spoke up, I worked 3 jobs just to afford tuition. I want to finish school, but every day I ask myself, should I just drop out? A factory worker from Ohio shared, I had a stable job. Then a machine took my place. I don't know what to do next. These weren't just stories. They were proof that something was fundamentally broken. And the more Barron listened, the clearer it became, people didn't need empty promises. They needed real action. And so, a movement began to take shape. Inspired by the conversations, young people across the country started organizing. In New York, students met with local officials to demand tuition reform. In Texas, factory workers pushed for retraining programs instead of mass layoffs. In Chicago, a group of educators launched a campaign to make financial literacy a mandatory part of high school curriculums, because what good was an education if students were never taught how to survive in the real world? No one was waiting for the government to fix things. They were doing it themselves. And Barron, who had once been a quiet observer, was now in the middle of it all. Not as a leader standing above them, but as one of them. Of course, not everyone was pleased. As the movement gained momentum, those in power began to push back. Seasoned politicians dismissed him as just a rich kid playing activist. Certain media outlets ran stories questioning his motives. Corporate leaders grew uneasy as workers started demanding more. One headline read, "Barron Trump, a true activist or just another privileged voice?" But Barron didn't engage in pointless debates. He didn't have time. Because he knew one thing: when the people in power start pushing back, it means you're on the right track. Then, something unexpected happened. A major youth organization in Washington, D.C. invited him to attend a National Youth Summit, an event where young voices could propose real policies directly to lawmakers. For the first time in history, a generation wasn't just protesting. They were demanding a seat at the table. Barron knew this was his biggest challenge yet. He could accept the invitation, step onto the national stage, and face those who held real power. Or he could stay in the background, let the movement grow on its own, and avoid becoming the center of even more controversy. He thought about it for a long time. Then, he remembered a message he had received from a high school student after his first speech. "I used to think my voice didn't matter. But because of you, I know it does. Thank you." And with that, Barron made his choice. He picked up his phone and responded with 2 words. "I accept." The invitation to the National Youth Summit in Washington, D.C. was an opportunity Barron Trump knew he couldn't ignore. It was one thing to speak to a crowd of students. It was another to sit across from lawmakers, the people who had the power to enact real change. But before he could step onto that stage, there was one final test: a live, nationally televised interview. The moment the announcement was made, the media went into a frenzy. Some hailed it as the interview of a generation, while others dismissed it as a publicity stunt. Social media buzzed with hashtags. Half the country wanted to hear what he had to say. The other half was just waiting for him to fail. On the night of the broadcast, millions of Americans tuned in. Some watched from their living rooms, others from their dorm rooms or phones, huddled in cafes and college campuses across the country. The stakes were high. If Barron faltered, if he hesitated, if he came off as unprepared, the movement he had helped spark could be over before it even had a chance to truly begin. The studio was cold. The lights were blinding. He sat across from a veteran journalist, one of the most respected, and ruthless, interviewers in the country. The man leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the desk, studying Barron like a chess player considering his next move. Then, the first question came. "Your speech shook the entire nation. But let's address the real question: do you actually understand what you're talking about? You're 18. Born into privilege. Raised in wealth. Do you really think you can speak for people who are struggling just to get by?" The air in the studio tightened. It was a direct hit, meant to throw him off balance. Barron didn't rush to respond. He let the silence hang for a moment, meeting the journalist's gaze. Then, he spoke, calm, steady, firm. "I won't pretend that I've lived the same struggles as they have," he admitted. "But I've met them. I've listened. I've heard their stories. And it changed me." The journalist raised an eyebrow. "And you think that's enough?" Barron's jaw tightened. "The truth is, they don't need me to speak for them. They need someone willing to amplify their voices. And if I have the platform to do that, I won't stay silent." For the first time, the journalist seemed momentarily caught off guard. But he wasn't finished yet. He leaned forward, setting his pen down. Hundreds of speeches have been given. Thousands of movements have started and faded. What makes you think you're any different? Barron hesitated, just for a second, then shook his head. I don't think I'm different, he said. But if we all keep waiting for someone special to come along and fix everything, nothing will ever change. A small round of applause rippled through the studio audience. The journalist smirked. He had been waiting for this moment, the final, defining question. Let's be honest, Barron. Are you doing this because you really want to help people? Or are you just building an image for a future political career? This was it. Barron didn't blink. Didn't flinch. He looked straight into the camera, knowing that millions were watching, waiting. I don't care why people think I'm doing this, he said, his voice unwavering. If someone wants to criticize me for speaking up, let them. But I'm not doing this for myself. I'm doing this for the people I've met, the ones who don't get to sit in this chair and tell their stories. And if anyone wants to question my motives, don't do it with words. Do it with action. Because words alone don't change anything. Silence. Then, a single clap. Then another. And suddenly, the entire studio was on its feet. A standing ovation. Social media erupted. For the first time, I actually believe a young politician isn't just saying what we want to hear. Barron Trump just proved he's not just a name, he's a movement. This isn't a rich kid playing politics. This is a young man who understands his power to make a difference. Barron scanned the room. He hadn't done this for applause. He hadn't done it for headlines. But something had changed. He was no longer just the son of a former president. He was no longer just a silent observer. He had stepped onto the battlefield. And this time, he was ready. The interview had ended, but the impact was just beginning. Barron Trump had walked into that studio as the son of a former president, scrutinized, doubted, expected to fail. But he had walked out as something more. Not a politician. Not an activist. But a catalyst. In the days that followed, the response was overwhelming. His words spread across the country like wildfire, igniting conversations in classrooms, workplaces, and coffee shops. Social media exploded with debates. News anchors dissected his every sentence. Some hailed him as the voice of a generation. Others dismissed him as a privileged kid who would never understand real struggle. But beyond the noise, something real was happening. Young people, many who had never been politically engaged before, were speaking up. Organizing. Taking action. Barron received thousands of messages, not just from supporters, but from students, workers, and teachers who weren't waiting for politicians to fix things. They were doing it themselves. In New York, students launched a petition demanding tuition reform and scheduled meetings with local officials. In Texas, factory workers formed a coalition to push for retraining programs instead of mass layoffs. In Chicago, a group of educators successfully lobbied for financial literacy courses to be added to public school curriculums. For the first time, change wasn't just a distant hope. It was happening. And Barron? He wasn't watching from the sidelines anymore. He showed up to student-led town halls. He sat with workers who had been displaced by automation. He listened, not as a politician looking for votes, but as a young man trying to understand. But with momentum came resistance. Corporate leaders grew uneasy as workers started demanding more. Some politicians, feeling the pressure, attacked him publicly. Certain media outlets painted him as an idealistic rich kid with no real solutions. Barron didn't waste time arguing. He had no interest in fighting media narratives. He knew that real change didn't happen in television studios or Twitter threads. It happened in communities. In classrooms. On factory floors. And so, he kept going. Then came the invitation. A major youth organization in Washington, D.C. was hosting the first-ever National Youth Summit, a historic event where young leaders could present real policy proposals directly to lawmakers. They wanted Barron there. Not as a speaker. Not as a guest. But as a representative of the movement that was forming around him. It was the biggest decision of his life. Stepping onto that stage meant walking into the heart of the political battlefield. It meant facing the most powerful people in the country, some of whom saw his movement as a threat. He could turn it down. Stay in the background. Let the momentum grow on its own. Or he could step forward. That night, as he sat by his window, staring at the city lights, he thought of Marcus, drowning in student debt. Linda, working 2 jobs just to survive. The girl at the protest, clutching her sign like it was her last hope. This wasn't about him anymore. It never had been. He took a deep breath, picked up his phone, and responded with 2 words. I accept. Months had passed since Barron Trump first stepped onto a stage and broke his silence. What had started as a single speech had grown into something no one, including himself, could have predicted. Across the country, young people weren't just talking about change, they were making it happen. At universities, students were leading discussions with policymakers about student loan forgiveness. In cities where automation had devastated the job market, displaced workers were organizing, demanding retraining programs rather than being discarded. High schools across the country were implementing financial literacy courses, because what good was an education if students weren't taught how to navigate the realities of adulthood? This wasn't just a moment. It was a movement. And yet, Barron knew that words alone weren't enough. A movement had to be more than just passion, it had to lead to real, tangible action. That's why, when he was invited back on national television, not as a guest being questioned, but as someone with a message, he knew exactly what he needed to say. This time, there were no reporters firing difficult questions at him. No skeptics waiting to see him fail. Just a camera. A microphone. And a nation watching. He took a deep breath, then looked straight into the lens. When I was younger, I believed that silence was the safest option, he began. I saw how words could be twisted, how a single statement could be turned into a weapon. So I stayed quiet. He paused, letting the weight of those words settle. But I've learned something important. Silence has power too. And if we're not careful, it can become the most dangerous weapon of all. Somewhere, in homes across America, young people sat up a little straighter. Today, I'm not asking you to agree with me. I'm not asking you to take my side. I'm asking you for one thing: don't let anyone convince you that your voice doesn't matter. His voice was steady. Clear. Unshaken. If you think the system is unfair, speak up. If you think something needs to change, act on it. And if you think you're just one person, too small to make a difference, remember this: every major movement in history started with one person who decided not to stay silent. The camera zoomed in slightly, framing the intensity in his eyes. The future isn't something we inherit. It's something we create. Then, the screen faded to black. And in bold white letters, one final message appeared. If not me, then who? If not now, then when? The impact was immediate. The video was shared millions of times within hours. It wasn't just a speech, it was a call to action. This wasn't about Barron Trump anymore. It never had been. It was about every student drowning in debt. Every worker left behind. Every person who had ever felt unheard, unseen, dismissed. And as his message spread, it became clear: the next chapter of America wouldn't be written by politicians in Washington. It would be written by the people who refused to stay silent. Barron Trump never set out to lead a movement. He never imagined that a single speech, a single moment of breaking his silence, would ignite something far bigger than himself. But now, as he watched the momentum grow, he understood a truth that had always been there: change doesn't begin with institutions. It begins with people. For the first time, young Americans weren't just shouting into the void. They were being heard. Universities were rethinking their tuition models. Cities were investing in retraining programs for displaced workers. Schools were introducing financial literacy courses. But more importantly, people, ordinary people, were realizing that their voices had power. Barron wasn't looking for applause. He wasn't interested in headlines. His mission had never been about fame. It had always been about something simpler, something more urgent, reminding people that silence is a choice. And so is speaking up. As he stood on a stage once more, facing a crowd of thousands, he didn't prepare a long speech. He didn't need one. He looked out at the faces before him: students, workers, parents, teachers, people from every background, every struggle. And he spoke the words that had changed everything for him. If not me, then who? If not now, then when? The roar of the crowd wasn't just applause. It was something bigger. It was a generation realizing that they weren't waiting for change anymore. They were becoming it.